Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Did the Prime Minister's decision to cut $1.7 billion from aged care leave aged care homes better or worse prepared for the pandemic?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And once again, the Leader of the Opposition comes to the dispatch box and asserts things that are just simply not true. Mr Speaker, it's not just me saying that. The Labor Party have made these allegations before. In fact, it was the previous Leader of the Opposition made the same allegations about a matter involving $1.2 billion, Mr Speaker, and of all sources to actually agree with the government. It may come as some surprise, but ABC Fact Check found that to be very misleading, Mr Speaker, and I table that for the benefit of the House, Mr Speaker. So, Mr Speaker, what I can advise the Leader of the Opposition about is that we've invested $3 billion since the 2018-19 budget into home care packages to support more Australians living in their homes for longer. We've released 14,275 new residential care places, including 13,500 residential places and 775 short-term restorative care places. We're investing $5.3 billion from the 1st of July to June 2022 for existing Commonwealth Home Support Program service providers to ensure continuity of in-home support services for over 840,000 across Australia. We've invested $21.9 million for My Aged Care operating costs. We've provided a $320 million boost to residential care subsidies. And we've given providers operating residential and home care access to independent business advisory services. We've provided almost $50 million for a business improvement fund to assist residential aged care providers in financial difficulty, including prioritisation for those in regional, rural and remote areas and affected by bushfires. Applications opened for the BIF on the 31st of March 2020. We provided an ongoing 30% increase to the viability supplement to support services in rural and remote Australia. We've provided an ongoing 30% increase to the homelessness supplement. We've established a new independent aged care quality and safety commission, implemented new consumer-based aged care quality standards, and we've introduced a new mandatory national quality indicator program, and we've committed over $1 billion to aged care support to ensure, Mr Speaker, that in response to the outbreak of coronavirus in this country, Australia's record stands, Mr Speaker, in a position that other nations have not even approached. That's not to say, Mr Speaker, there have not been failings. Of course there have. There have been 4 cases in 4 facilities in this country where the outcomes have been completely and totally unacceptable, Mr Speaker. In those 4 cases, Mr Speaker, there have been a total of 16 cases overall where we've had a significant impact, but in 97% of the aged care facilities in this country, Mr Speaker, there has not been a single resident infection.
The member for Griffith. And I call the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's plan for economic recovery is backing Australians by helping create jobs and new business opportunities across our nation?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question. And she knows, whether it's in her home state of Tasmania or anywhere else around the country, as we deal with the COVID pandemic, which has swept the world, and the COVID recession that has followed that pandemic, Mr Speaker, that is important that our response gets the balance right, assessing constantly the impacts to ensure that we're both saving lives but also saving livelihoods, Mr Speaker, in addressing the twin crises. And as we continue to work hard together with state and territory governments across the country to suppress the COVID-19 virus across Australia, and particularly now in Victoria after the significant community outbreak there, what we also know is we must continue to ensure that we support Australians who are doing it incredibly tough as a result of the COVID-19 recession. In the June quarter of this year, Mr Speaker, in the United Kingdom, their economy shrunk by 20%. There were large falls also in the United States and Germany of around 10%, and some, I think, 14%, Mr Speaker, in France. Now, our figures will come out next week, and the indicators are, Mr Speaker, that Australia will hopefully not see any of those figures in Australia, but that impact will still be significant, very significant, Mr Speaker. But we are making progress. We are making progress in bringing Australia back and getting the jobs back. The most recent payroll data shows that 43% of payroll jobs have come back as at the 8th of August since the beginning of the COVID recession after those jobs were first lost. And importantly, the two areas that were most significantly impacted by the job losses of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a 52% return in women's jobs that were lost, and for those under the age of 20, the comparison now with the pre-COVID period shows the jobs on payroll data are down by just 0.1%. We have seen the jobs for under 20s on that payroll data come back, Mr Speaker, to where they were at the start of the COVID recession. Mr Speaker, as the numbers in Victoria continue to improve, and we look forward to more improvement in the weeks and months ahead, that will see confidence continue to rise. And that is why it's important that we don't allow the country to go into some sort of economic retreat, but we need the country to keep moving forward and, wherever possible, continue to open up and make sure that we can get those jobs back into our economy, that we can get the businesses opened up again. And that is so essential that we continue to press forward and not allow a retreat in our economic position. Mr Speaker, that is why we will continue to lead with more than $300 billion of economic support into our economy and to support jobs. The JobKeeper legislation that is before the parliament now, extending JobKeeper again out to the end of March, is incredibly important support to the Australian people because it keeps Australians in jobs.
It's concluded. The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister seriously deny he cut $1.7 billion from aged care when page 172 of his 2015-16 MyEFO says about aged care funding the government will achieve savings of $472.4 million, and page 101 of his budget paper number 2 for 2016-17 says about aged care funding the government will achieve efficiencies of $1.2 billion?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the government increases funding for aged care by $1 billion every single year.
The member for New England.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the McCormack-Morrison government is supporting jobs in the aviation industry through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for New England for his question, Mr Speaker, and acknowledge his representation of regional Australia. At the outset of COVID-19, the aviation sector was hit first and hit hardest. At one stage, domestic passenger numbers fell from more than 1 million per week to around 30,000, and from 13,000 weekly flights to just 400. As a result of COVID-19, the aviation sector has experienced a 98% downturn. On Easter Sunday last year, Brisbane Airport handled 39,500 passengers, but just 31 passengers on the same holiday this year. These figures are stark. They are real. Job losses have been significant, and we know that any job loss is tough. Every Australian who has lost their job through COVID-19 is at the front of our mind as we put in place the measures to address the health pandemic and certainly address the issues around the economy and workers. We acted quickly, Mr Speaker. Our continued assistance measures are designed to maintain employment and crucial services around the sector, and I'm in daily communication with members of the aviation sector. Planes in the air equals jobs on the ground. Recently, there was a ludicrous situation at the Queensland-New South Wales border prohibiting critical staff from travelling to Ballina Airport. One Gold Coast aviation firefighter employed at the airport was told by Queensland border officials he would need to isolate for 14 days after every shift. The pathway forward for aviation begins with a targeted and pragmatic approach to the opening of borders. Not after Election Day on October 31, but right now, Mr Speaker. Border closures hurt aviation and they especially hurt the tourism industry. To date, we've invested more than $1.3 billion sector-wide assistance for aviation through various measures such as a $715 million airline assistance package to provide immediate and significant relief from fees and waivers, 2 regional aviation support packages, regional aviation network support and regional aviation funding assistance, airline funding assistance package, which totals $298 million to assist 16 regional airlines. And for many of those, they are taking PPE, respiratory devices, and other equipment, face masks and perhaps most importantly frontline medical personnel to regional and remote centres which would otherwise not see a regular flight or a flight at all. From this package we've secured for the member for New England's electorate, Mr Speaker, 8 weekly flights from Tamworth and 6 weekly flights from Armidale in that electorate. Regional Aviation Network Support Program is currently supporting up to 269 return services to 110 regional or remote locations across Australia. This is important support. We appreciate the fact that aviation has been hit very, very hard. We will continue to discuss these issues with members of the sector and continue to provide the measures that we need to.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Aged Care Royal Commission's interim report, titled Neglect, revealed that up to half of all older Australians in residential aged care are malnourished. They're literally starving. Didn't the Prime Minister's decision to cut $1.7 billion from aged care leave frail and vulnerable older Australians worse off?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The care and respect for Australians who are living in residential aged care is something that all members of my government, and I know that all members of this House, take very, very seriously. Absolutely. Very, very seriously, Mr Speaker. We have all had personal experiences, no doubt, of our own loved ones being cared for in residential aged care facilities, and we know how important it is. Mr Speaker, that is why our government has continued to increase funding for aged care. When we came to office, after the 2012-13 budget, in terms of aged care places and funding, that was at 186,278 registered residential aged care places. In the most recent budget, that has increased to 219,000 places, Mr Speaker. On in-home aged care places, we inherited just 60,000 places from those opposite, and in the 2019-20 budget we have increased that to 150,756 places. In response to the Royal Commission into aged care, Mr Speaker, which I initiated not long after becoming Prime Minister, there was an interim report that was released and it touched on 3 particular issues. And we, Mr Speaker, responded to each and every one of those 3 issues highlighted in that interim report, with 10,000 home care packages established at a cost of $496.3 million, $25.5 million to reduce the use of medication as a chemical restraint on aged care residents and at home. There was $10 million for additional dementia training and support for aged care workers and providers, including to reduce the use of chemical restraints, and $4.7 million to help meet new targets to remove younger people with disabilities from residential aged care. Mr Speaker, these were the matters that were highlighted in that interim report, and we moved very quickly to provide the funding to support that soon after that interim report came down. When its final recommendations are made next year, Mr Speaker, we will have the opportunity to respond in full to those in the budget of next year. In the meantime, in the budget of this year, we will continue to address the many challenges there are in aged care, not only the more than $1 billion that we've already put in to support our efforts to respond to COVID-19, but the other many issues that we continue to be aware of and have been acting on. In my earlier question, I ran through a series of funding commitments. Those funding commitments I outlined into the Leader of the Opposition's first question are only those that we've announced, Mr Speaker, since the Royal Commission was established. So we'll continue to look after our older residents, and we'll do it in a way that ensures their dignity and their respect.
Now it's the independent question, and I call the member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the Mercury newspaper reports that there have been no unannounced safety checks at Tasmanian residential aged care facilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. By comparison, the aged care regulator has carried out 63 unannounced visits in New South Wales, 63 in Victoria, 55 in Queensland and 20 in South Australia. In other words, the federal government is flying blind in Tasmania and hoping for the best, which amounts to willful and dangerous ignorance considering what we've seen in aged care elsewhere. Prime Minister, how can older Tasmanians feel safe in these circumstances? And how does the government explain the lack of inspections? And what are you going to do about it?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the Minister for Health may wish to add to this answer. This is a matter, Mr Speaker, that I've been speaking directly with the Tasmanian Premier about. Of course, the Aged Care Quality Commissioner undertakes their processes in relation to Tasmanian facilities, but I also know, Mr Speaker, that through the work that has been done through the Minister for Aged Care and agreements that we've been able to reach with the Tasmanian government, will be working through the very issues that you have highlighted. You're right to raise them, and it's important that this is undertaken. It's happening all around the country, and it will also happen in Tasmania. But the Minister for Health may wish to add to that answer.
Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to add to the Prime Minister's answer. On the 31st of January, the Department contacted aged care facilities around Australia with early preparation. All aged care facilities were contacted. That then followed in terms of actions which were taken on the 7th of February in relation to aged care facilities being contacted around the country. In addition to that, on a national level, what we've seen is that the 6th of March, the Minister for Aged Care and the Chief Medical Officer convened the Aged Care COVID Preparedness Forum, which was open to aged care facilities around the country. In addition to that, I'm advised that the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner has indeed been in contact with all facilities around the country. That includes both direct interviews. A number of those facilities around the country were deemed not ready in preparation in March off the basis of that, and standards were lifted and addressed across the country. In addition to that, and that was in relation to all aged care facilities, a further survey has been conducted by the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner of all facilities, with subsequent and additional contacts around the country.
And I call the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House about the historic levels of support the Morrison government is providing to help workers stay connected to their employers and to assist families as we make our way back to economic recovery?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for her question and acknowledge her experience as a Professor of Paediatrics and 28 years at the Royal Children's Hospital. Mr Speaker, now, COVID-19 is a 1-in-100-year event, Mr Speaker, and its economic impact is devastating. The OECD are estimating that the global economy will contract by about 6% this year in comparison to the GFC, which saw the global economy contract by just 0.1%. And we know from the June quarter GDP figures in other countries they've seen substantial falls, more than 20% in the United Kingdom, around 14% in France and around 10% in the United States as well as in Germany. Yet here in Australia, Mr Speaker, we've maintained our AAA credit rating, and that of the 1.3 million Australians who either lost their job or saw their hours reduced to zero since the start of the crisis, more than half of them are back in work, Mr Speaker, and around 700,000. Now, approaching this crisis from a position of economic strength has allowed us to announce and to commit to $314 billion worth of support, Mr Speaker. $314 billion worth of support, nearly 16% of GDP. And according to Treasury, that support has helped save 700,000 jobs, and the unemployment rate would have been around 5% higher than it is today if it were not for our government's economic support. So JobKeeper, already $42 billion has gone to Australian workers. The cash flow boost, more than $23 billion has gone to Australian workers. More than $9 billion with the $750 payments, and more than $9 billion for the coronavirus supplement. Right around our great country, there are great stories about what JobKeeper is doing to support businesses and families, Mr Speaker. Like a great story from the member for Higgins' own electorate about a group called Very Special Kids, a children's hospice providing vital counselling and clinical support. The CEO wrote to the member for Higgins, and that organisation has been supported well by the member for Higgins and her predecessor, Kelly O'Dwyer. And this is what the CEO said: "If not for JobKeeper, our position in sustaining essential services would have been significantly reduced. JobKeeper has enabled us to keep the engagement of our highly experienced and trained nurses, personal care workers, social workers and bereavement counsellors who provide essential care to some of the most vulnerable families across Victoria, with 80 of their staff on JobKeeper." Mr Speaker, JobKeeper is doing a remarkable job.
The member for Franklin.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Aged Care Royal Commission's interim report titled Neglect drew attention to aged care residents sitting or lying in urine or faeces. Did the Prime Minister's decision to cut $1.7 billion from aged care contribute to these shocking circumstances?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I've already addressed the misleading statements made by the opposition that they continue to assert,
Rankin.
and I have already informed the House of the significant increases in investments that have been made by the government when it comes to aged care. Mr Speaker, when I called the Royal Commission into aged care, when I undertook that soon after becoming Prime Minister, Speaker, I said to the Australian people that we would have to brace ourselves for some very hard information about how older Australians were faring when it came to aged care facilities in this country. And what we pointed out at the time, and what has been widely accepted, Mr Speaker, is that these challenges are ones that governments, our own, those that came before us, have been wrestling with for many, many years, over many decades. That the things that the Royal Commission are looking at are not just issues and failings that have occurred in more recent times, but over the last 20 years. And what we have seen, as the aged care demands have increased on the system, they have increased not just in number, but in the nature of the care that has become necessary. And for those of us who have had to make decisions about putting our own family, our own parents into aged care, we have known that when we've done that, we are putting them into pre-palliative care. And we know it won't be long, Mr Speaker, it won't be long in many cases, Mr Speaker, and it was certainly the case in my own experience, in the decision that my family had to make, that my brother and I and my mother had to make when my father went into residential aged care. So I don't accept the interjections from those coming from those opposite, and I would ask them to show some respect on this very personal, sensitive issue. Mr Speaker, when we make those decisions, we know, and the aged care sector knows, that they are having to deliver on a much higher level of acute care today than was the case 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And that means the demands are greater, and that means the actions need to be greater. And that's why, Mr Speaker, our government has continued to increase funding in aged care every year by, Mr Speaker, more than $1 billion every year, Mr Speaker. And we will continue to do that, and we will do more. And you will see more in the budget, and you will see more in next year's budget, just as people have seen in every statement now for going back several years, increased places made available, particularly in in-home aged care. It is a challenging area, Mr Speaker, and we must show respect and dignity for people who are living in residential aged care facilities or wherever they're receiving our care, and that is our commitment to the Australian people.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's investment in vaccine research and development, including the molecular clamp being developed by the University of Queensland?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Robertson, who's been a great advocate for medical research, in particular with regards to the development of the new Central Coast campus for medical research in her own area. I want to welcome, as a sign of hope, not just for Australians but for people around the world, the latest findings from the University of Queensland with regards to the development of the molecular clamp vaccine candidate. These are what are known as preclinical trial findings announced and released today. What they show is that the early testing indicates that antibodies are being developed and the virus being neutralised. I just want to repeat that. Antibodies being developed and the virus being neutralised. That is what we seek with a vaccine. That is what gives hope and that is what gives protection. That is the process which has allowed us, whether it's in dealing with smallpox or measles or polio or so many other conditions over the course of the last century, to offer transformative hope and medical outcomes. The next thing that's occurred is that in mid-July, phase 1 clinical trials began. Those phase 1 clinical trials, for which we don't have the data yet, are about establishing the safety of this vaccine, and we are hopeful that the vaccine candidate, the molecular clamp, will be successful in those. All of the early indications are positive, and that is why this government, through an independent assessment process, has provided $5 million of medical research future fund investment. It's part of a much broader approach, the vaccine strategy which the Prime Minister announced last week. Firstly, research, for which there's $358 million available for vaccines, preventions and treatments. Secondly, direct procurement, and we've already reached the first agreement with regards to AstraZeneca and the first stage of that, which was announced last week, for whole-of-population vaccine supply in this nation. Thirdly, the international coalition, the work with Gavi and the COVAX facility. Funding was announced today for Australia to assist lesser developed countries in our region to have access to this international outcome. It was an act of national commitment to our own region. And then finally, there is the development within our own nation, through CSL, of production facilities, production in Australia for Australians. So we welcome today's announcement by the University of Queensland that the molecular clamp is making real progress in helping to fight coronavirus and give Australians hope and protection.
I call the member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Productivity Commission revealed older Australians with high care needs in New South Wales are waiting almost 3 years for a home care package. Did the Prime Minister's decision to cut $1.7 billion from aged care leave these older Australians better or worse off?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I've already addressed the misleading statement that has been made by those opposite regarding funding, Mr Speaker, and what the ABC fact-check actually demonstrated, that, Mr Speaker, on issues relating to where there was integrity matters within the aged care sector of overpayments, despite that, Mr Speaker, and those measures that the government introduced, the funding for aged care was increased by $1 billion, Mr Speaker, and has continued to be increased by $1 billion, in fact more than that, every single year. And one of the most significant areas, Mr Speaker, where we've continued to increase funding has been in the area of in-home aged care places, Mr Speaker. And as I said before, in-home aged care places under our government has risen from around 60,000 when we came to government to over 150,000 now, Mr Speaker, and we're going to keep increasing those places as we go forward, as we did immediately after we received the interim report of the Royal Commission, immediately putting a further 10,000 places into the in-home aged care network. Now, Mr Speaker, we will keep increasing our funding in aged care, in residential aged care and in-home aged care. And I would invite those opposite to support those increases and to support the reforms that I believe will be necessary when it comes to aged care in the future, just as we, when we were in opposition, supported the Labor Party, as the member, the Shadow Minister for Emissions Reduction, will recall, when he worked with opposition members at that time to introduce important changes in aged care. I would hope that when we deal with the Royal Commission to aged care, we might be able to deal with it in a similarly cooperative fashion, and that aged care not be used for political purposes.
I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting training and skills as part of our plan to drive Australia's economic recovery?
The Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills and Family Small Business.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the hard-working member for Lindsay, and I know that she is very proactive in promoting local businesses in her electorate and to assist them with their skills training, so that she can create the opportunities, particularly for young people in Western Sydney and in her electorate of Lindsay. Now, Mr Speaker, this week is National Skills Week, and as Australia recovers from the economic impacts of COVID-19, supporting a skilled workforce has never been more important. Now, our government just don't start. Our government is committed to ensuring that we make the skills sector more responsive to industry needs, more flexible and more attractive to potential students of all ages. For too long, Mr Speaker, skills training has been viewed as the second-class citizen, the second-rate option. You ripped $1.2 billion
members on my left.
The
member for Sydney's warned. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So we recognise how important skills is going to be for the future and to lead us out of this recovery. We need to make sure that we are supporting businesses to help them to produce the skilled pipeline of workers that we need, because that is going to assist them as they come through this crisis. Now, Mr Speaker, we are investing over $6.5 billion to keep apprentices in jobs, to help out-of-work Australians to reskill, to promote vocational training and to fill skill shortages. Now, Mr Speaker, let me take you through just some of the ways that we are helping that to occur. We're partnering with states and territories to establish a $1 billion job trainer fund to rapidly provide more Australians with access to free or to low-cost training places in areas of identified skills needs. Now, the Job Trainer Fund is going to create almost 350,000 training places starting from next month to help upskill and retain school leavers and job seekers, and retrain them, most importantly. Now, this fund targets training that is going to give people the best opportunity of getting a job in the future and providing the skills that businesses truly need. Now, Mr Speaker, there are many things that we are doing as a government, and I've just gone through some of them, but it is important that we recognise how significant it will be to our future to make sure that we have the skilled workforce that businesses, that industry need right across Australia. Mr Speaker, we have done a lot of work in the vocational education sector to rebuild the sector, and we are now turbocharging it with Job Trainer.
And I now call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On Monday, I asked about a 95-year-old resident at the Kalinya Care aged care facility who had ants crawling from her open wounds. The Royal Commission report called Neglect drew attention to inadequate prevention and management of wounds, leading to septicemia and death. Does the Prime Minister take full responsibility for the consequences of his $1.7 billion cut to aged care?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Once again, I reject the assertion that is made by those opposite, because aged care funding under our government has increased by $1 billion every year. In fact, more than that, Mr Speaker. It's at $1.2 billion each year. And yesterday I had the opportunity to respond to the member's question, and when I added further the answer in relation to Kalinya Care and what led to that outbreak and the actions that the government took in relation to that outbreak, and I can provide further details to the member should he wish to receive them outside of the chamber, because I won't delay the chamber with the extensive information we have in relation to that particular facility. But in all cases, we will continue to increase our support and funding for aged care facilities, be they residential aged care as required, or indeed in-home care. We will continue to increase the number of places available, continue to invest in expanding the workforce in the aged care sector, where there are significant demands, and they will only grow. as will be the case in the disability care sector, where we have to build a very big and very substantial workforce. And one of the things we're doing right now, Mr Speaker, is ensuring that as we are going through this COVID-19 recession and this COVID-19 crisis, is we'll be using those places that we have available, that we're creating through the Job Trainer program that the Minister was just referring to train more and more people, to be able to move from one sector where they might be working now. And in fact, many of those who are working in the hospitality side of the aviation sector are being retrained to actually go and work in the care sector, whether that be in the aged care sector or that be in the disability care sector. And so there'll be opportunities as we go even through the difficult processes of a recession to see more workers go into the areas of employment that will be available, and care in aged facilities as well as in-home care and disability care will be a key demander for people to come into those jobs and to provide that support. So we'll continue to pursue those strategies to address the very issues that Royal Commission have already started to identify. And as they identify other issues and as their recommendations come forward, we'll be able to consider those fully in the budget for next year, Mr Speaker. And in the meantime, the Treasurer, when he hands down the budget in October, will also be addressing even more pressing and immediate needs in the aged care sector, as we have already done so in relation to COVID, with more than $1 billion already committed in our COVID response to aged care.
I call the member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is providing critical support to small businesses to help drive Australia's economic recovery as we come out of the other side of the corona pandemic?
The Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills and Small and Family Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question. Now, he understands small businesses because he has owned and operated a small business, just as I have, just as many people on this side of the House had as well. So we understand from first-hand experience how challenging it is to run a small business, and it's because of that understanding and that first-hand experience that our government has understood the enormous difficulties and challenges that businesses, particularly small businesses, have faced due to the restrictions and the disruptions that have been brought about through the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr Speaker, without a doubt, small businesses are the engine room of our economy. Throughout this crisis, they have demonstrated agility, they have demonstrated innovation, and they've shown an enormous determination to get through this crisis. Now, whether that's through pivoting to a new type of production, whether it's taking their business online and doing that in a very, very short space of time, or whether it's modifying their work practices so that they continue to operate in a COVID-safe environment. They've done what has been required of them, and they've done that so that they can adapt to live and to work in this COVID environment. And they've done that, Mr Speaker, because it is essential to their survival to do so. We have backed them with some very practical programs, such as the JobKeeper program, which so far has meant that over $40 billion has flowed to almost 1 million businesses with over 3.5 million employees, and that's giving them the certainty that they need and the confidence that they need to stay in business. Now, I'm sure that the member for Bonner and every member in this place has had local business owners tell them what a lifeline JobKeeper has been for them, how it has done exactly what it was intended to do, which was to help businesses retain their staff and to keep their doors open. Now, there are a number of other measures that we have put in place, including tax measures to boost cash flow. That's delivered around about $20 billion in support. Our COVID resource hub, which we have established, has had about 5 million views since March, and we've responded to over 65,000 direct inquiries. Mr Speaker, small business is in the coalition government's DNA, and we back them all the way. Common sense throughout this, Mr Speaker, must prevail, and I can assure our hard-working small businesses that we will be rolling up our sleeves and we will be doing all that we can to keep them working every single day, because Australia is open for business.
Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, sadly, the Productivity Commission has revealed that 4 out of 5 older Territorians are not having their care needs met. This rate's doubled since your cuts to aged care. Prime Minister, do you take any responsibility for the cuts, the $1.7 billion cuts to aged care, and the impact that it has had on older Territorians and left them a lot worse off? What are you going to do about it?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, once again, what is put forward by the member opposite in relation to the funding of aged care is not correct, Mr Speaker. It misrepresents completely, as I've already outlined to the House, and I'll ask the Minister for Health to respond further.
The Minister for Health. Members on my left. The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And in adding to the Prime Minister's answer, I think simple facts will help address the question. In relation to when we came to government, there was an approximate budget of $13 billion for aged care. That has now grown. So this year, in the year completed, almost $22 billion, $23 billion, $24 billion, $25 billion over the course of the forward estimates. Most significantly, what we've also seen as part of that is the growth in home care from, as the Prime Minister said, 60,000 packages to 164,000 packages over the course of this budget. So from 60,000 to 164,000 at the end of the current forward estimates period. That's an increase of 150%. There were some comments before about, gosh, the population has continued to age. All of these figures, home care, residential care, both in terms of places and in terms of funding, overall aged care funding have grown at a significantly faster rate than the rate of older Australians, the rate at which older Australians has increased. The reason we've done this is because we have realised that that which was there before us was inadequate. That's why we are nearly doubling the funding over the course of our time in government compared with what it was under the previous government. That's a commitment that has entailed very serious ongoing work from the Expenditure Review Committee, from the Cabinet and others. It's meant that in 2020, for example, we provided more than $1 billion in funding to assist older Australians in aged care during the COVID-19 pandemic. What we've been able to do is invest $3 billion since the 2018-19 budget to provide an additional 50,000 home care packages. I might draw an interesting comparison here, though. Given the opportunity only a year ago to invest, the opposition invested how much in new home care places? Zero. The opposition, as they went to the election, invested how much in new residential care places? Zero. So for all of this discussion, at a time when the Prime Minister had called a Royal Commission, had highlighted the importance of this issue, had emphasised with the investment in residential care and home care places the importance, there was nothing from the opposition.
I call the member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. And will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is creating jobs in the defence industry to support our economic recovery as we come out through the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Always a pleasure to get a question from the member for Stirling, and want to thank him for his service to our nation, and also thank him for his passion and interest in Australia's defence industry. Mr Speaker, this morning the Prime Minister and I had the pleasure of travelling to Datapod in Fyshwick together with the Minister for Defence, where we met, and I'm sure the Prime Minister would agree, some very, very impressive systems engineers. Great credit to Datapod and great credit to those young people who've got, they tell me, it's their gem job, it's the job of their dream. So congratulations to them. Whilst we were there, Mr Speaker, we had the pleasure of announcing our government's $1 billion jobs and recovery plan for defence industry, and proudly that will create around 4,000 new Australian jobs. This package, Mr Speaker, includes around $500 million of further investment in estate and infrastructure packaging. What's important about this package is that the majority of this work will be done in regional Australia, with a great focus on those areas that have been impacted by the bushfires. A couple of good examples out at HMAS Albatross at Eden, and also out at RAF Base East Sale in Gippsland. Mr Speaker, during the coronavirus, many of the base's major contractors had issues with getting resourcing, human resourcing materials across state borders, and what that enabled the local tradie, the local contractors, and enabled them, those regional contractors, to get opportunities that ordinarily they wouldn't have got. So this $500 million is critically important for those tradies who are still trying to get ahead, who've been impacted by bushfires, who are still trying to get ahead. This is going to be an incredible injection for those local regions, so great news for them. And in more good news, the package also includes an increase to a number of defence skilling and innovation grant programs. In particular, Mr Speaker, is what we call the SADI grant program, Skilling Australia's Defence Industry, and we've increased that from $4 million a year to $17 a year. Now, this is important, Mr Speaker, because we need to continue to develop our defence industry skills for Australia. We need to help businesses who want to get into defence industry. We need to give them the skills they need, even just to tender for that work. We need to make sure that those individuals who want to transition from one career or one industry into defence industry, that they get that opportunity, like ex-Qantas, like ex-Virgin technicians who are looking for a long career with maintaining our aircraft. So great opportunities for them. Mr Speaker, as I've said in the House here a number of times, our government has continued to back defence industry, in particular with the payments of invoices. Since March, we've paid 190 invoices valued at $15 billion. $11 billion of that has been paid early. We continue to back Australians.
Concluded. I call the member for Franklin.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Productivity Commission has revealed complaints about the quality of aged care rose by more than 50% in the 2 years before the pandemic. Did the Prime Minister's decision to cut $1.7 billion from aged care leave frail and vulnerable older Australians better or worse off?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very pleased to answer this. One of the things that we have done is to establish the first ever Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner. This is an important role designed precisely to ensure that we are investigating the situation of individuals, that we are allowing for overall quality control, and this was something which was done on our watch, in our time, to ensure that there is oversight and that there is visitation, over 620 visits during the course of this pandemic alone. In addition to that, we have established and put in place the National Aged Care Mandatory Quality Indicator Program. That so far has already established indicators and put into place indicators which measure pressure injuries, use of physical restraint, unplanned weight loss in particular, so a focus precisely on issues with relation to nourishment and care. There are further elements that are being developed right now in relation to falls and fractures, and all of these are in line with the reducing misuse of medicines in aged care settings actions which we've taken with regards to the budget. More broadly and more generally, as I said earlier, and as the Prime Minister has said, we have gone from a $13 billion investment in aged care under the previous government to a projected $25.444 billion investment in the final year of the current forward estimates. The average increase has been $1 billion and more, and what we're seeing at the moment is that being put into place. With regards to the home care packages, I think it is worth emphasising that there were 60,000 home care packages under the previous government. and that has grown now to 150,000 and growing to 164,000 over the course of the current forward estimates. The elderly population has not doubled in that time, but our funding has more than doubled. Our funding has close to tripled. The places have more than doubled. And so it's very important to understand, on the opposition's own terms, that the ratio of places to elderly is dramatically higher under us. The ratio of places to elderly is dramatically higher, and that does lead to increased quality of care. That does lead to the passionate commitment that we have to supporting elder Australians being put into place. So every day we fight for these things because we believe in them. That's why we've invested. That's why we've more than doubled the places. That's why we've almost tripled the funding. That's why we've increased the ratios. All of these things, coupled with, of course, the Royal Commission, the cop on the beat and the quality indicators are about saving lives and protecting lives.
The member for Forward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on how the gas-led recovery supports the Morrison government's plan to create jobs and secure affordable and reliable energy?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for his question. He knows we're absolutely focused on delivering affordable, reliable gas for hard-working Australians, including in his electorate of Ford, Mr Speaker, and he knows that an affordable, reliable supply of gas is crucial to powering our way to recovery, job creation and investment we need. He also knows that gas keeps the wheels of industry turning, including in his electorate, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, even before COVID struck, we were seeing significant reductions in gas prices at the wholesale level, 42% reductions, and we've seen further reductions since then. It's recently been confirmed by reports from the AER, the Australian Energy Regulator, and the ACCC. And the ACCC and AER both point out that this is helping to put downward pressure on wholesale electricity prices. Indeed, again, before COVID struck, a 40% reduction in wholesale electricity prices, Mr Speaker. At the same time, we know gas provides the firmed power necessary to balance the record levels of investments we're seeing in solar and wind, Mr Speaker. Indeed, last year was a record level of investment in solar and wind, over 6 gigawatts, 6.3 gigawatts of investment last year, $9 billion, and we're expecting, the Clean Energy Regulator is expecting to see similar levels of investment this year. Far from competing with renewables, gas complements those renewables, Mr Speaker, by helping to stabilise the grid and reducing emissions at the same time. Mr Speaker, gas also provides that critical feedstock for industries like chemicals, like fertiliser for agriculture, Mr Speaker, like plastics for PPE, essential industries for this country. Now, Mr Speaker, there is more to do. We need to see those low spot prices, short-term prices and the lower international prices being passed through into longer-term contracts for their customers, Mr Speaker. Our competitive advantage as a nation has been for many years reliant on low-cost, reliable energy, and it's essential we see our local manufacturers getting access to those longer-term contracts. We also need to see strong supply of gas, Mr Speaker. We've seen strong supply of gas in Queensland. We need to see it in the southern states, and that's why we've entered into a state energy deal with the New South Wales government that includes a 70 petajoule commitment to gas in a market of 120. That'll mean further projects and further supply in the southern states, which is essential for this country. Mr Speaker, when it comes to gas, unlike those opposite, we know exactly where we stand. Unlike those opposite, we are committed to a strong, reliable, affordable supply of gas necessary to create jobs coming out of COVID-19.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government's report on the deadly COVID outbreak at Newmarch House said families reported weight loss, dehydration, pressure sores and increases in urinary tract and skin infections amongst fragile residents. Why hasn't the Prime Minister taken full responsibility for the consequences of his $1.7 billion cut to aged care?
The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. I've already addressed the misleading remarks that he has presented again, Mr Speaker. I mean, it would seem that the opposition that is being presented here, the Labor Party that is being presented here, is just an outdated version of what was rejected, Mr Speaker, by the people at the last election. And they continue to go forward and put these false things forward, just as they did before the last election, and here they are again, Mr Speaker, doing exactly the same thing. But to address the serious issue of the Newmarch House report, Mr Speaker, the Commonwealth Government has already made significant changes of how providers are experiencing COVID-19 outbreaks as a result of what was done with the report into Newmarch to ensure the earliest possible identification of all COVID-19 cases. The immediate and repeated testing of all residents and staff should be implemented as soon as a single case is identified. Now, yesterday I went through quite a number of cases and questions raised by those opposite about how that initial testing was done immediately after the Commonwealth was notified. The Older Persons Advocacy Network is now automatically engaged at every outbreak to provide access to advocacy services for providers, residents and their families, as I indicated in response to the cases that we saw yesterday when I was referring to matters that had occurred in Victoria. The Department and now the Victorian Aged Care Response Centre in Victoria provides communication support to providers in the event of an outbreak, including funding for that work, Mr Speaker, which was also one of the lessons from the Newmarch report. The Commonwealth has expanded the number of surge workforce providers available for services directly impacted by COVID-19, for example the RCSA, and the Department is engaging greater support for new staff, including with practical infection controlling, including support from AUSMAT members. There were many lessons from the Newmarch report, Mr Speaker. Those lessons were actually discussed openly amongst premiers and chief ministers and myself, Mr Speaker, and it has worked its way into the response that has been provided both by the Commonwealth and the Victorian State Government presently, Mr Speaker, in dealing with the challenges that are there. And that has enabled the number of facilities that have been identified as significantly impacted and on that Category 2 watch list, as is known, has reduced from 13 down to 3, Mr Speaker. And I can report again, based on the report I had this morning, that those 3 centres in Victoria remain in a stable condition, albeit they are under a close watch.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Resources, Water and Northern Australia, the place to be. Will the minister outline to the House how the McCormick-Morrison government's commitments to the resource sector and explain why programs like Exploring for the Future are so important to job creation and securing Australia's economic recovery?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Thank you for the call, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for Flynn for his question. I was up in the honourable member's area in recent weeks, and on the ground, Ken O'Dowd is known as the member for coal. He's known as someone who actually stands up for the resources sector and the jobs that it creates. So, Mr Speaker, we know that regional Australia has been hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic. But we know that they are resilient, we know they are looking to recover, and we know that the resources sector will be an enormous part of what this country does into the future. Over 240,000 Australians are still employed in the resources sector, Mr Speaker. And in the local members' electorate, anywhere from Gladstone to Emerald, from Emerald to Taroom and right across, they know the resources sector is keeping the lights on in this country. They are the ones out there working hard all the way through the challenges of the coronavirus. Now, Mr Speaker, our JobMaker plan is for the long term. Our JobMaker plan is for a secure future for all Australians. For all Australians. This is why we continue to invest in the resources sector, Mr Speaker. This is why, on this side of the House, we actually support the resources sector. Whether it's coal, thermal or met, whether it's gas, whether it's gold, whether it's critical minerals, we actually support the people that work in this sector. Mr Speaker, we continue to support them. So recently I announced $125 million for the Exploring for the Future Fund. And why is that important, Mr Speaker? Because we know it works and in the future it will help to create jobs. We know that the former Exploring for the Future won, how successful it was, and in fact over an area of about 130,000 square kilometres, and that's twice the size of Tasmania, I'm advised, Mr Speaker. Some 16 companies on the back of the data produced through the Exploring for the Future program are out there doing exploration, looking for the next big thing. If they hit pay dirt, Mr Speaker, just one, if they hit pay dirt, there's an expectation they could create over 1,100 new jobs and up to $2.5 billion worth of benefit to the local and national economy. Just 1 out of 16. So this is a very important investment for the future of our country, but it does require support not only from governments but particularly those opposite in terms of the resources sector. We need to be united in what will drive our country forward. We need to support the sectors which continue to support our nation and its growth, particularly when it comes to employing people like apprentices. So, Mr Speaker, I've been in Cairns and Gladstone and Townsville and Emerald. I've been in Cloncurry and Mount Isa, all the way from Gundawindi to Moree to Dubbo to Wagga to Orange in recent weeks, and the people of regional Australia are resilient. They know they will recover. They know the resources sector and the ag sector and others will be the backbone of our economy, as it has been over a long period of time. And, Mr Speaker, it is people like Ken O'Dowd and the members in regional areas who are out there fighting for their sectors, fighting for jobs, fighting for the resources sector, and long may it be so, because that is how we'll recover.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister, and I refer to comments of the Liberal MP for Monash, Russell Broadbent, who said yesterday he'd sounded warnings about the aged care sector for years, and I quote, "but I was ignored completely," end quote. If the Prime Minister won't listen to Labor and won't listen to his own Royal Commissioners, will he at least listen to his own backbench and acknowledge that his cuts of $1.7 billion have contributed to the problem?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I note the comments made by the Leader of the Opposition referring to the comments by the member for Monash. Mr Speaker, the member for Monash, like I think all members of this place, feels passionately about the care that is provided to elderly Australians. And he has been passionate about that for as long as I have known him, Mr Speaker. From my very first speech in this place, my maiden speech, as we sat together on those opposition benches alongside the member for Macmillan, as he was known then, Mr Speaker. And I've always known him someone to speak his mind and to speak passionately in our party room, and he will always stand up for his constituents in his community, Mr Speaker, and that's why he has been returned to this place, I believe, on so many occasions. And in fact, Mr Speaker, back in 2017 he raised many of these issues and in fact stood down from 2 parliamentary positions in relation to the way that he believed that his issues need to be addressed. And this was a significant factor, I can tell you, Mr Speaker, that after I became Prime Minister, because of the many times I'd heard Russell Broadbent get to his feet, I believe we needed to have a Royal Commission into aged care, Mr Speaker. And, Mr Speaker, I know that the member for Monash, Mr Speaker, I know the member for Monash was very pleased to see the fact that we introduced that Royal Commission to aged care. And the member for Macmillan said successive governments over 30 years, Mr Speaker. He refers to as the failings in aged care. Over 30 years, Mr Speaker, and he knows that. And his comments reflect the frustration he has had over a long career in this parliament, and the challenges we have to deal with in aged care address and will need to address, Mr Speaker, failings over a long period of time by governments of all persuasions. And these failings have occurred in private sector operators, not-for-profit sector operators, and indeed public sector operators. In fact, the Royal Commission followed the terrible events that we saw at the Oakton aged care facility in South Australia, Mr Speaker, which was a publicly run facility. Now, Mr Speaker, whether it's public, private or not-for-profit is not the issue. What the issue is ensuring that we get the funding to where it needs to be done, that we can continue to train the workforce and continue to lift the standards and ensure the clinical training is there so that people who are in aged care facilities get the care and the dignity and respect that they deserve. That is something that the member for Monash and I agree passionately on together.
The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is streamlining environmental approvals to fast-track economic recovery while maintaining strong environmental protections?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Curtin for her question and congratulate her on her outstanding start on the floor of this parliament as an educator, Vice-Chancellor of Notre Dame University and passionate about young people and their learning. Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister said, we're working hard with our states and territories to focus our energy and our efforts throughout this pandemic, not on wasteful process, but on positive results.
As part of this, the National Cabinet agreed that all states and territories would move to single-touch environmental approvals underpinned by national environmental standards. We're also fast-tracking assessments for 15 priority infrastructure projects without reducing environmental protections. These 15 projects are worth more than $72 billion in public and private investment, and they'll support more than 66,000 direct and indirect jobs. This includes key WA infrastructure projects like the Metronet Rail project that will support growth of Perth's metropolitan region, main roads projects in regional WA like the Tonkin Highway, Bunbury Outer Ring Road and the Albany Ring Road. Mr Speaker, the WA government is keen for these projects to progress, as are our West Australian members, like the member for Curtin and the member for Canning and the member for Forrest. And we know that WA will be one of the first takers of our single-touch model. Earlier this month, Premier McGowan made very strong statements in support, saying this agreement will pave the way for important job-creating projects while maintaining the highest environmental standards. He was most enthusiastic. The Environment Minister, Stephen Dawson, said in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic there's never been a more important time to facilitate economic activity while safeguarding the environment for future generations. And I look forward to similar support from the Federal Labor Party for our single-touch approvals. In fact, yesterday the Leader of the Opposition was thumping the table in support of WA Labor, moving motions to suspend standing orders, saying we stand with WA Labor. And so they should. And so they should stand with their Labor counterparts, both premiers and chief ministers. Mr Speaker, we're doing more. We're halving the backlog of outstanding decisions. We're improving assessment times. We're delivering quick and robust decisions. But it's not just about faster approvals. It's about better approvals with strong protections for the environment. After this year's bushfires, we're taking a careful approach. We're working closely with proponents to ensure that whether we need to secure additional offsets for species protection or maintain the high-quality habitat that is so important post-fires, we're protecting the environment, protecting jobs and protecting our economic future.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister take full responsibility for the consequences of his $1.7 billion cut to aged care, which made older Australians worse off before the pandemic and left residents of aged care homes more vulnerable to the deadly COVID virus?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, once again, the Leader of the Opposition comes forward and says there were cuts to funding to aged care. Mr Speaker, when funding goes up every year, that means there's more funding each year. When there's a cut to funding, Mr Speaker, it means there's less funding. Now, these issues may be beyond the wit and wisdom of the Leader of the Opposition and his apprentice shadow treasurer, Mr Speaker, with the training wheels still on to understand these issues, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, the sorcerer's apprentice, the Deputy Prime Minister refers to him as, Mr Speaker. But when funding goes up every year by $1 billion and more, that's a good thing. And, Mr Speaker, that is what has been happening with aged care funding in this country. That's why the number of in-home aged care places has risen from 60,000 to more than 150,000, Mr Speaker, under our government, and will continue to increase. That's why the number of residential aged care places and funding for residential aged care places has increased under our government, Mr Speaker. That is why we have put in place the Aged Care Quality Commissioner. That is why, Mr Speaker, we have continued to support reforms in the aged care sector, and in particular—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yeah, point of order, Mr Speaker. The question went to the $1.7 billion cut. The Prime Minister has to address the $1.7 billion cut.
The Leader of the Opposition
that's in my
will resume his seat. The Prime Minister is in order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I couldn't have been more relevant to the misleading remarks made by the opposition, which are exactly the same misleading remarks that were made by the previous Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. He probably did it with a bit more credibility than this one, Mr Speaker. But what is true is that the government has been increasing our funding for aged care, as I and the Health Minister, in response to myriad questions today, have been able to demonstrate to this House and to the Australian people. There is more funding, Mr Speaker. There is more funding. And there is more than $1 billion in additional funding on what I've referred to go to our COVID response, Mr Speaker. And that is why, despite there being extreme and severe impacts in 4 facilities in Victoria, Mr Speaker, severe, and in Newmarch, Mr Speaker, and Dorothy Henderson Lodge, which compared to what happened in Victoria, which was even worse in Victoria, Mr Speaker, in those 4 centres. It was unacceptable. And the government has made that very clear, and I indeed have issued an apology in relation to those 4 facilities, and that's what's called taking responsibility. But, Mr Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition does seem to have here is a blind spot in what is happening in Victoria. He seems to be the only person in this country who thinks there has been no community outbreak of the coronavirus in Victoria, and that has had an impact right across Victoria, which has got people locked up in their homes at the moment, Mr Speaker, and under severe stress and strain as a result of what has occurred in Victoria. Now, Mr Speaker, we have worked hard to mitigate the impact of that in the aged care sector.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table a document.
I am indeed, Mr Speaker. 2 documents, in fact. Mr Speaker, page 172 of my EFO from the Treasurer in 2015-16, and page 101 of budget paper number 2 for the 2016-17 budget, which says the government will achieve efficiencies.
The Leader of the Opposition, yep.
And the cuts are there.
Yeah, well, no, I won't even go to the Leader of the House. As I've made clear on numbers of occasions, if they're parliamentary papers and freely available, I won't even ask leave. The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister please outline to the House the Morrison government's commitment to supporting the agricultural sector, including through enhancing trade opportunities and providing freight assistance?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Grey for his question and acknowledge the rich and proud history that the electorate of Grey has in contributing to the agricultural sector. But we should also be more broadly proud of our farmers. Despite fires and drought and flood, now COVID, they continue to be able to put the best food and fibre on the shelves for us every day, as well as contribute last year more than $54 billion worth of exports. And we'll continue to support agriculture's ambitious goal of reaching a $100 billion industry by 2030. And there's renewed confidence for agriculture to achieve that, particularly with recent rains and looking at bumper winter harvest. And it's important that we continue to understand we put the environment around them. And that's why we announced a further $2 billion to the Regional Investment Corporation to allow farmers to be able to get $2 million loans to restock and replant with no interest and no repayments for 2 years. That allows them to repair their cash flow with no burden from banks. That's a huge saving to these farmers to get them back up on their feet and achieve that goal. But as we increase our production, it's important that we also understand that we put the environment around them in trade agreements. And this government has secured many trade agreements, whether it be China, Japan, Korea, the TPP-11, now Indonesia only coming into effect on the 5th of July, a significant trading partner just on our doorstep. And we continue to pursue trade agreements in the EU and UK to give our farmers the opportunity to spread their risk. That's what we'll continue to undertake to support the Australian agricultural sector, support the regional communities that support them as well. But we've also wanted to make sure that we protect Brand Australia. And we've done that not just through our investment in biosecurity, $850 million in making sure that we keep pests and weeds away from destroying our brand of having the best product in the world. But now we're wanting to be one of the most reliable exporters to our export partners around the world, and we've created an international freight assistance mechanism where we've understood that with the reduction in the number of passenger flights that have come as a result of COVID-19 has reduced, we've had to make sure that we can get our high-end agricultural product into those key export markets to make sure those export partners know that we are reliable. but it also gives us a competitive advantage, because when we come out of COVID-19, our trading partners will know they can rely on Australian farmers more than anyone else in the world. This will be something that Australia will lead the world on and give our farmers the leading edge. There's over $1.15 billion worth of agricultural product that will be going out on planes committed already. And this program continues to show the demand of Australian exporters in their demand in sending it around the world. This is an investment in Australian agriculture, but it's an investment in our Australian economy as well.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask the further questions be placed on the
Thank the Prime Minister.